Hello everyone, let me ask you something. Have you ever been lying next to your partner at night? Your body's close enough to touch, but somehow you feel miles apart. You remember the early days when just a glance or a whisper would send sparks racing through your body. And now sometimes silence feels heavier than words. You talk about the bills, the kids, the errands. But when was the last time you truly looked at each other? Not just saw, but looked with that curiosity, that hunger, that sense of wonder. Intimacy doesn't die suddenly. It fades quietly, little by little, hidden beneath routine, responsibility, and unspoken resentments. One day you wake up and the touch that used to feel electric now feels absent. The laughter you once shared is replaced with sighs of exhaustion. And you wonder, what happened to us? But here's the truth, intimacy doesn't vanish on its own. We unknowingly kill it through habits, through neglect, through the way we stop showing up for each other. Today, I want to take you deep into this reality, because if you're over 30, if you're married, if you've lived long enough to know that love is not a fairy tale, but a practice, then this conversation is for you. Let's talk about the 5 things you may be doing without even realizing it, that slowly, quietly kill intimacy in marriage. Let's settle into this together, because what we're about to explore isn't just theory, it's the lived reality of so many marriages. Intimacy, real intimacy, is fragile. It doesn't disappear with one argument, or one busy season, or one mistake. It fades in whispers, in silence, in the things we stop doing. And the first thing I want to talk about, the first slow killer of intimacy, is the loss of curiosity. Think back to when you first met your partner. Do you remember how curious you were about them? Every detail mattered. The way they held their coffee mug, the way they tilted their head when they listened, the story of their childhood best friend. You wanted to know everything. You asked questions. You leaned in. You discovered. Curiosity was alive. And curiosity is the lifeblood of intimacy. Without it, we fall into assumption. We think we know our partner so well that we stop asking. We stop listening as if there's something new to discover. And when curiosity dies, desire soon follows. Because let me tell you, desire doesn't live in certainty. Desire is fueled by mystery, by the sense that there is still something about the person lying next to you that you don't fully know. And yet, so many couples fall into the trap of thinking, I already know who my partner is. But people evolve. The person you married 10 years ago is not the same person today. And when you stop being curious, you miss out on who they are becoming. I once worked with a couple who had been married for 15 years. When they came to see me, they told me that the spark was gone, that they felt like roommates. And I asked them, when was the last time you asked your partner a question that you didn't already know the answer to? They looked at me, puzzled, as if the very idea was foreign. And yet, that's exactly where the work began. Curiosity reawakens intimacy, because when you ask, when you listen, when you allow yourself to be surprised, you recreate the conditions for desire. But the opposite is also true. When we stop asking, when we assume we know it all, when we stop being curious, intimacy withers. So I want you to ask yourself, when was the last time you looked at your partner as if they still had secrets to share with you? When was the last time you invited them to tell you something about their day, their dreams, their fears, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest? Now, the second intimacy killer I want to share with you is one that hides in plain sight. It's the slow erosion of presence. I don't mean just physical presence, though that matters. I mean emotional presence. Being there not just in body, but in attention, in energy, in heart. You see, so many couples spend time together but are not really together. They sit across the dinner table with their phones. They share a bed but not a conversation. They drive in the same car, but each one is lost in their own world. Presence is the oxygen of intimacy. Without it, love suffocates. And yet, in today's world, presence is so often the first thing we sacrifice. We think multitasking is harmless. We think answering one more email while our partner is talking doesn't matter. We think scrolling while sitting next to each other is normal. But the truth is, when your partner reaches for you and what they encounter is your distraction, your absence, your half attention, they stop reaching. And when they stop reaching, distance grows. I remember a woman who told me, I don't need my husband to spend hours with me. I just need to feel like when he's with me, he's with me. Not half on his phone, not half in his head, but really here. That's what presence is. It's not about the quantity of time. It's about the quality. And presence communicates something deeper than words. It says, you matter. I choose to give you my attention. I choose to see you. When presence is missing, intimacy begins to starve. You may still share routines, responsibilities, even sex, but the emotional closeness, the sense of being cherished, begins to fade. And that is why I say presence is not optional if you want intimacy to thrive. Now, let me connect these two ideas, curiosity and presence, because they are intertwined. Curiosity without presence is shallow, and presence without curiosity is flat. When you bring them together, though, when you are present with your partner and curious about who they are, you create the conditions for intimacy to grow, to breathe, to expand. So ask yourself honestly, are you truly present when your partner speaks to you? Or are you half listening, waiting for your turn, scrolling, distracted? Are you curious about who they are right now in this season of life? Or are you assuming you already know and treating them as if they are a fixed story instead of a living, evolving human being? Because here's the thing, intimacy is not built in grand gestures. It's built in the small, everyday moments where presence meets curiosity. It's built in the way you look up from your phone when your partner walks into the room. It's built in the way you ask, what did that mean to you? Instead of assuming, it's built in the way you notice the small changes, the subtle shifts, and say, I see you. And when those moments are missing, when curiosity dies, when presence fades, intimacy doesn't collapse overnight. It simply goes to sleep. And many couples don't realize it until they wake up one day and wonder where the closeness went. So tonight, I want you to try something simple. When you're with your partner, put the phone away. Look at them. Ask them a question you don't know the answer to. Not, how was your day, but something deeper. What made you smile today? What's something you've been thinking about lately that you haven't told me? If you could change one thing about this week, what would it be? Invite them to surprise you. Invite yourself to rediscover them. That is how intimacy breathes again. And as we sit with these truths, the need for curiosity, the power of presence, we begin to see that intimacy isn't something you either have or don't. It's something you cultivate. It's something you water like a garden. Ignore it and weeds of distance grow. Tend to it and it flourishes. When we begin to reawaken curiosity and bring presence back into the relationship, something shifts. You may notice that your partner softens when they feel truly seen. You may notice that you yourself begin to rediscover them, not as the person you assume they are, but as someone still unfolding before you. But even as we nurture this, there is another force at play, one that quietly erodes intimacy like rust beneath the surface. It is the accumulation of unspoken resentment. Resentment is like a silent poison in marriage. It doesn't arrive with a loud crash. It drips slowly. Over time, it builds each time you feel unheard but stay silent, each time you compromise without acknowledgement, each time you say, who's fine, when it's not fine. And here's the paradox. Resentment is often born out of love. We resent most where we have invested most. We resent because we cared, because we gave, because we expected that what we offered would be seen and reciprocated. But in many marriages, resentment festers in the shadows. We tell ourselves it's not worth bringing up. We avoid conflict because we fear rocking the boat. We say, I'll let it go, but we don't. We hold on to it quietly. And little by little, that unspoken tension creates distance. Because here's the truth, you cannot build intimacy with someone you are secretly resenting. I once sat with a man who told me, I don't feel close to my wife anymore. When I asked him why, he said, because every time I try to reach for her, I'm reminded of all the times I felt she dismissed me. And when I asked if he had ever told her this, he shook his head. No, because I don't want another argument. I don't want her to think I'm blaming her. So instead of voicing his pain, he buried it. And in doing so, he built a wall, stone by stone, between himself and the woman he loved. Resentment thrives in silence, and silence is intimacy's greatest enemy, because intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires you to say, this hurt me, even when it's uncomfortable. It requires you to reveal the small wounds before they become scars. But here's what often happens. Couples wait until resentment has piled so high that when it finally bursts, it does so with rage, with contempt, with years of unsaid words. And by then, the original wound is buried under layers of anger. It's not about the socks on the floor or the dishes in the sink or the forgotten anniversary. It's about the story underneath. I feel unappreciated. I feel invisible. I feel like what matters to me doesn't matter to you. This is why resentment kills intimacy. Because intimacy is about closeness, and resentment creates distance. It makes you withdraw emotionally, even if you are still physically present. It makes you withhold affection or touch or warmth, because beneath the surface, you are holding a scorecard, and intimacy cannot live where scorekeeping rules. So how do we deal with resentment? Not by ignoring it and not by exploding with it, but by learning to name it early, gently, without blame, by saying, when this happened, I felt hurt, instead of waiting until it becomes you always, you never, by giving voice to the small grievances before they accumulate into resentment. One of the most powerful things you can do for your intimacy is to cultivate regular spaces where honesty is welcomed, where you can sit with your partner and say, can we talk about what's been on our minds? Not as a confrontation, but as an invitation to clarity. Because when resentment is aired in the open, it loses its power. When you are able to say, I felt overlooked when you didn't ask me about my day, and your partner responds with presence instead of defensiveness, intimacy deepens. Now, here's something I want you to notice. Resentment doesn't only live in words left unsaid. It also shows up in the way we withhold. We withhold affection. We withhold sex. We withhold kindness. We begin to punish our partner, often unconsciously, by pulling back what once was freely given. We do it not to be cruel, but because we feel hurt. But the result is the same. The bond weakens. And when withholding becomes a pattern, intimacy begins to feel unsafe. Because instead of the relationship being a place of openness, it becomes a battlefield of subtle punishments. One partner withdraws, the other chases. One withholds, the other resents. And the cycle continues until both feel lonely, even while lying side by side. So if curiosity brings freshness and presence brings closeness, then addressing resentment brings safety. Because intimacy cannot grow in a soil of bitterness. It needs the air of honesty, the warmth of forgiveness, the space to repair. And repair doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. Repair means saying, I see how I hurt you. I see how this created distance. Let's find our way back. And here's the beautiful thing. When couples learn to repair resentment, intimacy doesn't just recover, it deepens. Because there is nothing more intimate than being able to reveal your wounds and still be loved. Nothing creates closeness like saying, this is where I felt small, and hearing your partner say, I never want you to feel that way with me. But if resentment is left unchecked, if silence prevails, the relationship slowly starves, which brings us to another intimacy killer, one that is connected but distinct. It is the neglect of desire. You see, many couples confuse love with desire. They think that if they love each other, desire will simply follow. But desire doesn't work that way. Love is about closeness, about safety, about comfort. Desire, on the other hand, is about distance, about intrigue, about wanting what is just out of reach. And in many marriages, the pursuit of love ends up suffocating desire. I've often said love and desire are not the same. They feed each other, but they also contradict each other. Love wants to minimize distance. Desire thrives on it. Love is about certainty. Desire needs mystery. And this paradox is where many couples get stuck. They build a life of safety, of routine, of togetherness. But in the process, they forget the dance of attraction, the play of longing, the spark of novelty. Desire dies when we stop tending to it. When intimacy becomes only about comfort and no longer about play. When the bedroom becomes the place we sleep, but no longer the place we explore. When sex becomes a routine checklist instead of a source of creativity, laughter, and passion. And so many couples tell me, we love each other deeply, but we don't feel that spark anymore. What they don't realize is that intimacy is not just about love. It's also about keeping desire alive. And that requires effort. It requires imagination. It requires you to sometimes step out of the roles of mother, father, husband, wife, and step into the roles of lovers again. Because without desire, intimacy becomes flat. You may have closeness, you may have safety, but you lose that electric charge, that pulse that makes you feel not just loved, but alive. When couples tell me, we love each other, but the spark is gone, they're naming something important. They're recognizing that intimacy is not only about stability, it is also about vitality. And that vitality depends on how we nurture desire. But even when we begin to understand this, another obstacle often appears. An intimacy killer that hides behind what feels like responsibility, but is really emotional neglect. Let's talk about the erosion of emotional connection through neglect. Not the neglect of chores or dates or even the occasional anniversary. I mean the neglect of emotional investment. The kind of neglect that comes when you stop feeding the bond, not with grand gestures, but with everyday tenderness. Neglect is sneaky. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It whispers when you forget to say thank you because you've come to take their efforts for granted. It whispers when you no longer reach for their hand in public, when you no longer text just to say, I was thinking of you. It whispers when you forget that your partner is not simply a co-parent, a roommate, a colleague in the logistics of daily life, but a lover, a friend, a human who still longs to feel chosen. I once spoke with a woman who said, I don't want diamonds. I don't want grand vacations. I just want him to notice when I walk into the room. I just want to feel like I still light him up. That's the language of intimacy. It's not about what you buy. It's about how you see. Emotional neglect doesn't come from malice. It comes from forgetting to see. And when we stop seeing, we stop nourishing the bond. Here's the truth. Intimacy is not kept alive by maintenance alone. Yes, paying the bills matters. Yes, raising the kids matters. Yes, planning the schedules matters. But if all you share is management, then you are business partners, not lovers. And business partnerships, while useful, are not intimate. This is why I often tell couples the opposite of love is not hate. It is indifference. Hate at least acknowledges presence. Indifference erases it. And emotional neglect is nothing more than the slow slide into indifference. Think about it. How often do you stop to notice your partner, not for what they do, but for who they are? How often do you pause in the middle of your busy life to remind them, I still see you? Emotional neglect creeps in when we forget that intimacy is a practice, not a given. And it's not just about words, it's also about gestures. A gentle touch when passing in the kitchen, a warm glance across the table, a note tucked into a bag. These are not trivial, they are reminders. They are anchors, they say, even in the middle of everything, I choose to turn toward you. Now, here's the difficult part. When emotional neglect takes root, many partners stop asking for what they need. They tell themselves, I have to ask. It doesn't count. They stop requesting affection, compliments, time together, because they want it to be offered freely, and so they sit in silence, hoping their partner will notice, while feeling more and more unseen, and the distance grows. But intimacy doesn't thrive on telepathy. It thrives on expression. If you feel neglected, it is not weakness to ask for what you need. It is strength. It is giving your partner the opportunity to show up for you instead of resenting them for not reading your mind. Still, neglect often feels safer than conflict. So couples drift. They drift into parallel lives. They share the same space but not the same heart. And slowly the relationship becomes a place of loneliness. Two people side by side but alone. This, for me, is one of the saddest patterns in long-term marriages. Not the fighting, not even the betrayals, but the quiet withdrawal into emotional neglect, because neglect kills not with fire, but with coldness. And once intimacy is frozen, thawing it requires courage. Courage to admit, I miss you. Courage to reach out when you fear rejection. Courage to reintroduce warmth into a space that has grown chilly. But here's what I've seen. When one partner begins to reawaken emotional investment, the other often responds, because beneath the neglect there is still longing. Longing to be loved, to be noticed, to be chosen. So ask yourself, where have you allowed neglect to settle in? Where have you stopped showing your partner the small gestures that once came so easily? Where have you assumed that love, once declared, no longer needs expression? Because love, like intimacy, needs tending. And remember, neglect is not always about absence of time. Sometimes it happens in the middle of togetherness. You can spend hours together and still feel neglected if your heart is elsewhere. Emotional neglect is not about proximity. It's about attention, energy, intention. So tonight, before you go to bed, I want you to try something simple. Place your hand on your partner's hand. Look them in the eye, and instead of talking about what needs to be done tomorrow, tell them one thing you appreciate about them. Something they did, something they are, something you noticed. Watch what happens when you bring warmth back into a space that may have cooled. Because intimacy doesn't thrive on autopilot. It thrives on intention. And when we let go of intention, neglect takes its place. But even beyond neglect, there is one more intimacy killer I want to bring into the light. It is more destructive, more corrosive, and more dangerous than all the others combined. And that is contempt. When I say that contempt is the most dangerous intimacy killer, I don't say it lightly. Curiosity can fade, presence can waver, desire can cool, neglect can creep in, and yet with effort, all of these can be revived. But contempt is different. Contempt corrodes the very foundation of love. It is the venom of intimacy. And once it seeps in, it changes how you see your partner, how you speak to them, how you allow yourself to be with them. What is contempt? It is more than anger. Anger says, I care enough to be hurt. Contempt says, you are beneath me. It shows up in sarcasm, in eye rolling, in dismissive tones. It hides in the words, you always, and you never. It lives in mockery, in belittling, and the subtle ways we express superiority. And intimacy cannot survive where one partner feels diminished. I once witnessed a couple in session. The husband was sharing something vulnerable, a fear he had about his job and about being able to provide. And as he spoke, his wife rolled her eyes and muttered, here we go again. The look on his face in that moment said everything. He closed off. He retreated. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply shut down. Because contempt doesn't just wound, it humiliates. And when we feel humiliated, we no longer feel safe to be open. That's the tragedy of contempt. Intimacy depends on safety, the safety to be vulnerable, to be imperfect, to show our fears and our longings without being mocked. But contempt strips that safety away. It turns your partner into an adversary, someone to be defeated rather than a companion, someone to be cherished. And contempt rarely begins with malice. It often grows from years of unresolved resentment, unspoken disappointments, unmet needs. Instead of being addressed, those hurts transform into disdain. The little frustrations accumulate until you no longer see your partner through eyes of tenderness. You see them through eyes of judgment. But here's the thing. Contempt doesn't only destroy intimacy in the moment. It rewrites the story of the relationship. Once contempt takes hold, even the good moments become tainted. If your partner brings you a cup of coffee, instead of gratitude, you think, too little, too late. If they try to kiss you instead of warmth, you feel irritation. Contempt erases generosity. It makes every gesture feel insincere. And yet, many couples live with contempt as if it is normal. They joke at each other's expense in public. They speak to each other with sarcasm instead of kindness. They allow small cruelties to slip into daily life, forgetting that every cutting remark leaves a scar. But intimacy cannot live in a place of ridicule. Love cannot grow in soil of disdain. So what do we do when contempt has crept in? First, we must name it. We must be honest enough to say, this way of speaking, this way of looking, this way of dismissing, it is contempt and it is killing us. Naming it strips away its disguise, because contempt often masquerades as humor, as cleverness, as just the way I am. But when you name it, you recognize it for what it is, a weapon that destroys closeness. Second, we must replace contempt with curiosity and compassion. Instead of saying, you always, we say, help me understand why this keeps happening. Instead of rolling our eyes, we look with softness. Instead of mocking, we ask. Contempt pushes away. Compassion draws near. And perhaps most importantly, we must repair the small cruelties before they calcify. When you speak sharply, acknowledge it. When you belittle, apologize, not later, not after the damage has multiplied, but in the moment. Say, I spoke to you in a way that was unkind. You didn't deserve that. That humility is what keeps contempt from becoming permanent. Now, let's be clear, contempt isn't only in words. It is also in tone, in body language, in silence. It is in the way we sigh when our partner talks. It is in the way we dismiss their needs as trivial. It is in the way we stop taking their inner world seriously. And every time we do this, intimacy shrinks. One man once told me, I feel like nothing I say matters. She always has a way of making me feel small. And when I asked his wife about it, she said, I didn't even realize. I thought I was just being honest. But honesty without kindness is brutality. And brutality has no place in intimacy. So if you want to protect your relationship from contempt, practice reverence. Reverence doesn't mean putting your partner on a pedestal. It means treating them with dignity, even in conflict. It means disagreeing without degrading. It means remembering that the way you speak to your partner shapes how they see themselves in your presence. Because at the end of the day, intimacy is not only about closeness, it is about respect, and respect cannot coexist with contempt. I want you to pause and ask yourself, how do I speak to my partner when I am angry? Do I roll my eyes? Do I mock? Do I diminish? And if I do, am I willing to stop? Not for the sake of politeness, but for the sake of preserving our intimacy. Because here is the truth, contempt doesn't just kill intimacy, it predicts divorce. It is one of the clearest signs that a relationship is in crisis. But it doesn't have to be the end. Couples who recognize contempt, who name it, who commit to replacing it with compassion, can rebuild. And when they do, intimacy often returns stronger than before because respect has been restored. So far, we've spoken about curiosity, presence, resentment, desire, neglect, and contempt. And all of these weave together to paint the picture of why intimacy dies in so many marriages. But the story is not only about what kills intimacy, it is also about what revives it. Which is where I want to take us next. We've walked through the quiet ways intimacy fades, the loss of curiosity, the absence of presence, the weight of resentment, the neglect of desire, the drift of emotional neglect, and the sting of contempt. And now I want to speak of the final intimacy killer, the one that makes all the others harder to repair. It is the absence of repair itself, the refusal to men to return to choose each other again after rupture. Every couple fights, every relationship faces misunderstandings, disappointments, moments of disconnection. Conflict is not the enemy of intimacy. In fact, conflict can be a doorway into deeper understanding. What kills intimacy is not conflict, it is the lack of repair. When we do not repair, small cracks widen into deep fractures. A harsh word left unacknowledged becomes a wall. A broken promise left unattended becomes a canyon. And slowly, the relationship begins to feel unsafe. Not because of the conflicts themselves, but because there is no pathway back to closeness. Repair doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean you never hurt each other. Repair means that when you do, you find your way back. You say, I'm sorry. You say, I was wrong. You say, I see how I hurt you and I want to do better. Those words spoken with sincerity are like water to a dry garden. They soften, they heal, they reopen the possibility of intimacy. But many couples refuse repair, often without realizing it. They let pride stand in the way. They let silence fester. They avoid the discomfort of vulnerability, and in doing so, they leave wounds untreated. And untreated wounds do not disappear. They infect. I remember a man who told me, I can handle arguments, but what I can't handle is the silence that follows. It makes me feel like I don't exist. His wife, on the other hand, thought silence was the safer choice. She believed avoiding the conversation would prevent escalation, but in reality, her silence became abandonment, and that absence of repair cut deeper than the conflict itself. Repair requires humility. It requires you to step off your pedestal, to let go of the need to be right, and to choose instead to be connected. It requires you to prioritize love over ego. And yet, when couples learn this, intimacy not only returns, it deepens. Because what could be more intimate than saying, even in our brokenness, I choose us. So I want you to think of repair not as an admission of defeat, but as a celebration of commitment. Every time you repair, you are saying, our love matters more than this fight. Our intimacy matters more than my pride. That's what keeps relationships alive. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of repair. And when we look back over everything we've explored, we see the full picture. Intimacy dies not because love disappears, but because we stop feeding it. We stop being curious, we stop being present. We let resentment harden, desire fade, neglect settle in, contempt take root, and repair fall away. But the good news is this intimacy can be revived. Love is not static. It is dynamic. It breathes when you breathe life into it. So if you've recognized yourself in any of these patterns, do not despair. Recognition is the first step to transformation. The fact that you are listening now means that you care, and caring is the soil where intimacy can grow again. Start small. Tonight, ask a new question. Tomorrow, look at your partner with presence. When you feel resentment, voice it with gentleness. When desire feels dim, bring play back into your connection. When neglect has crept in, choose one small act of tenderness. When contempt tempts you, choose respect instead. And above all, when rupture happens, as it always will, choose repair, because marriage is not sustained by grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It is sustained by daily choices, by the way you speak, the way you listen, the way you turn toward instead of away. Intimacy is not found, it is made, and you have the power to make it again and again. So as we close, let me leave you with this. Intimacy is not the absence of struggle. It is the art of turning struggle into closeness. It is the courage to say, I still want you, even when it would be easier to turn away. It is the practice of seeing your partner not as someone you already know, but as someone still waiting to be discovered. And if you can hold on to that, if you can keep choosing curiosity, presence, desire, tenderness, respect, and repair, then intimacy will not just survive, it will flourish. Thank you for being here with me today. If this spoke to you, I invite you to share your own experiences in the comments. Because when we speak about intimacy honestly, we discover we are not alone. And if you found value in this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join me for more conversations that matter. Here's to love that doesn't just endure, but thrives. Here's to intimacy that grows deeper with time. And here's to choosing every day to keep seeing each other with fresh eyes.